Welcome to my second video in what has now become a series on Canadian Highlander pointing philosophy. This video is going to look at what I describe as second-tier pointing frameworks. The focus for my first video was sort of very high-level ways to evaluate cards within a vacuum. It was more vision-oriented than it was mechanic-oriented. So with this video, I'm going to be diving deeper into each mechanic and deeper into the cards, the decks, and some specific meta examples of how these frameworks apply. At a relatively high level, I've broken down the second tier frameworks into 13 different frameworks. It's important to note that these are less sort of hard categories than they are just ways to help frame the discussion that I'm going to be having. I want to make it clear that these categories are not mutually exclusive, and they are not collectively exhaustive. There will be overlap between what they mean, there will be overlap in what they represent, and cards will rarely, if ever, fall into exactly one category. More often than not, they'll fall into multiple. Before I get started, I do want to say a special thanks to the Canadian Highlander Discord. Their discussion and feedback helped educate this video, and it helped educate my perspective on many of these cards. I also want to note that this is going to be much closer to a podcast style discussion than it is to a PowerPoint. I have not prepared slides for this video. I felt that it was a better fit for this video's content to sit down and sort of talk directly into the microphone than it was to guide it via slides. Most of the slides would just have card images on them, and I mean, you're an adult, you have Scryfall, you can figure it out. To kick us off, I'm going to start by briefly going back over the first tier frameworks that I used in my first video on the subject. I want to be able to refer to them throughout the video, so I just want to make sure that even if you haven't listened to the first one, that they're not unfamiliar to you. Of course, this will not be a focus of the discussion that I'm going to be having. The first sort of pillar of the first tier frameworks is the Canadian Highlander is an eternal format. This is a format where individuals who enjoy playing the oldest Magic cards will be able to and rewarded for doing so. We are an eternal format. People like playing with Black Lotuses and Ancestral Recalls, and we are not going to take away that from people for any reason if we don't have to. The second pillar is that there is archetype diversity in Canadian Highlander. We want the three big macro archetypes of aggro, combo, and control to each have the tools necessary to be well-represented archetypes and to be viable at the highest level within Canadian Highlander. Lastly, we want to impose the fewest number of restrictions upon cards or decks in this format. Our goal is to achieve competitive balance, but we need to, we don't want to overpoint cards if we don't have to. We want to keep the number of cards pointed to the smallest number. Chapter 1. Framework 1. Cards are too powerful in terms of point value. The first framework that we're going to be diving into is that there are some cards that are too powerful if we don't point them. They're free to include within your deck. And the best way to frame this is that some cards are just so generically strong that they belong in your deck pretty much no matter what it is that you're doing. Some examples include Mana Vault, Tainted Pact, Mana Drain, and Fourth Aerlingus. They're great examples of this principle at work. It's not that these cards unto themselves are egregiously powerful. They're obviously very strong, but if they were 0 points, it would almost always be incorrect not to play them if you're already in those colors. These cards aren't really game plans, strategies, or decks unto themselves. They are almost always add-ins to whatever your deck is currently doing and don't really require any concessions or adjustments to deck building just to include them. They tend to be within the best 100 cards that your deck has access to in most scenarios. Most decks in Canadian Highlander play cards that are simply powerful because they are powerful, and there are a lot of cards that fit into this category that aren't pointed. Cards like the Fetch Lands, Wasteland, the cantrip suite of Brainstorm, Ponder, and Preordain, Force of Will, Ancient Tomb, Urza's Saga, Ragavan, Minsc and Boo. For the most part, these cards just fit into most decks. You don't have to think too hard about whether or not these cards belong. You probably should just play them. Obviously, this is a sliding scale. As we get to know cards more, they enter and leave this sort of warning list of 0 to 1 point cards. A card like Library of Alexandria was once a perfect example of this principle. It was just generically strong and you should probably play it, but it's fallen by the wayside as other cards have taken its place. The One Ring sent up a ton of these alarm bells when it was first printed, but people have realized that it doesn't really violate the raw deck proliferation that a card needs to fall into to cause problems, and the strength of the card is definitely mitigated by the 100 card singleton aspect of this format in comparison to 60 cards. I touched on it briefly, but it's important to note that this section primarily speaks to 0 and 1 point cards. Cards that are 0 get uppointed if they're too free and too powerful to include. And as cards get included in wider and wider ranges of decks, they begin to create these alarm bells and violating this proliferation or free to include principle. The key indicators of a card hitting the threshold of getting pushed to 1 as a result of this principle, of this framework, is that when it is empirically very powerful, sees play in decks across multiple archetypes, and doesn't have many, if any, reasons to exclude it from your deck, because it fundamentally synergizes with everything else your deck is trying to do. Framework 2. Cards are too powerful in terms of deck construction. In other words, it's wrong to exclude them. Coming off the back of this principle of it's free to include is the contrasting principle of it's wrong to exclude. The key difference is that free to include means that every deck and every style is going to play it because it's free. Wrong to exclude means that every deck is going to morph itself to being a deck that is able to play that card. And this is most apparent with cards that end up costing multiple points. For example, if Thassa's Oracle was 0 points, it would probably be incorrect not to play a Thassa's Oracle deck. Your deck would warp itself to be able to support Oracle plus Consults or Tainted Pact pretty much no matter what other deck building costs are present, just because of how strong the combo would be. The card at the given point value makes a specific deck or type of deck so strong unto itself that it's mostly wrong not to play the deck. Other cards that fit into this world are obviously the other A plus B combo cards, Time Vault and Flash, and I think Tinker and Underworld Breach also fit into this category as well, albeit somewhat softer than those A plus B combos because of the greater amount of deck building restrictions that are required to support those cards. I think there's a decent argument to be made that if Ancestral Recall was 0 points, there would not be a viable non-blue deck. But I think that's less indicative of this second framework I'm trying to make. If Ancestral Recall was 0, it would more likely fit into the first category in that it's wrong to, it's free to play. You should just play Ancestral Recall. Framework 3. Cards are too powerful in terms of flexibility. These are cards that do just a little too much of everything. They are powerful because they are so flexible and so broadly applicable that they're virtually never bad to draw. The most obvious examples of pointed cards are the best tutors, so Demonic Tutor, Vampiric Tutor, Mystical Tutor. Other tutors like Wishclaw, Survival, Merchant Scroll, Imperial Seal, they're much weaker, but are obviously just so generically flexible unto themselves that they do tend to be a little bit too powerful to be free. I think Uma Zawajite has a few problems within this framework as well. It does, it has 3 different abilities that are all important and relevant and flexible given the different context and the different board states. And so it tends to be a little too powerful in terms of flexibility. There are cards that don't sit on the points list that fit into this category. It includes cards that were formerly pointed, like Crop Rotation and Transmute Artifact. But we can also take a measurable step down in power level to talk about some other cards that are very flexible. This principle applies to cards like Uro, Oko, Omnath. These cards provide a lot of value on almost every resource axis all at once, and they're very flexible in being able to cover multiple holes all at once. What makes these cards different from the free to include category is that not every deck wants an Oko, an Uro, or an Omnath. Setting aside that they're less powerful than Brainstorm, for example, they just don't fit into every deck. Like Gruul Monsters isn't interested in splashing white and blue for a 4/4 with no keywords. If these cards were a little bit more pushed, they probably would be too powerful in terms of flexibility, and we would be having discussions about pointing them, but they're just not egregious enough or break enough of the other frameworks to cause problems. Framework 4. Cards are too powerful in terms of efficiency. These are cards that, in contrast to doing everything decently, they just do one thing really, really well. And oftentimes, those axes in which it does the very, very good thing are extremely obvious. All of the fast mana in our format do the fast mana thing a bit too well to be let loose on the world. Lotus, all 5 Moxen, Mana Crypt, Soul Ring, Mana Vault, these are all top tier cards in terms of mana efficiency. And there are plenty of cards that are highly efficient in terms of mana, but they have these downsides or are just not so egregiously efficient, and they don't earn themselves a point within this framework. Cards like Mox Opal, Lotus Petal, Grim Monolith, Lion's Eye Diamond, Chrome Mox, Mox Diamond. These are all cards that live in highly efficient mana spaces, but come with downsides in terms of flexibility, they're sort of card disadvantage, or they're just not as efficient, and they haven't either earned a point or they never will. There are a number of lands worth discussing from the efficiency side, both pointed and unpointed lands. Strip Mine, I think, is by far, empirically, it is by far the most efficient way to remove another land, and Wasteland being not far behind it, although they do have a 2-point differential. There are 3rd and 4th versions of the land removal effect that exist within our format, but the fact I can't name them is indicative of those two's sort of standout efficiency. Tolarian Academy and Gaia's Cradle both live on either side of the point line, both being very efficient and best in slot for their respective archetypes. Sarah's Sanctum is also a card that they printed at one point. I also think that Mishra's Workshop, City of Traders, and Ancient Tomb are honorable mentions in this world of being very efficient lands, and there has been, of course, discussion recently about the efficiency of Ancient Tomb as being potentially too efficient for the land slot and potentially deserving a point. I think it's very obvious to note, but most of the high-pointed cards on our list got there by means of their efficiency. Recall is 3 cards, Ancestral Recall is 3 mana below rate. Time Walk is 3 mana below rate. Demonic Tutor is 2 mana below rate. Tinker's closest lookalike doesn't even look much like Tinker. They're just too scared to print another card like Tinker. The efficiency category is by far the broadest category, and almost every card can be evaluated on its efficiency. But I think that this category is the best place to discuss the fast mana and the ramp, so I wanted to highlight those types of cards. For the sake of time, I'm going to avoid listing literally every single card Jeskai plays in terms of efficiency before we move on from this framework. Chapter 2, Framework 5. The card is too powerful within decks because it creates effect density problems. This refers to an effect which with only a single copy wouldn't be problematic. When you're able to play many more copies of those effects, they do begin to become troublesome within your deck. Due to the somewhat elegant nature of the points list and the 100 card singleton nature of our format, it is awfully hard to clear this bar. The only real examples of density problems that occur in our format are tutors. In 60 card formats, you might not have any problem with 4 copies of Serum Visions, but by the time you've got access to 4 Preordains, 4 Ponders, 4 Brainstorms, you begin to have an effect density that can be a problem and warp the format or the metagame around just the sheer density of that effect. I think the best deck to illustrate density problems is Flash. Even bad tutors like Merchant Scroll and Summoner's Pact have been pointed or still are because of the problems associated with how many tutors can exist within a given A+B combo deck. The density of cards that confine Flash and Protean Hulk are greater than the density of cards that confine Oracle and Consult, but not by a lot. These two decks put an intense amount of pressure on the tutor density in this format. Because you have different card types with each of these combos, you do end up on primarily black tutors, So cards like Grim Tutor, Profane Tutor, and even stuff like the Transmute, Muddle the Mixture, and Shred Memory, for example, end up seeing play in these decks, but don't quite clear that bar of getting pointed. Time Vault has been responsible for its own set of tutor constraints, Transmute Artifact getting to live on the points list thanks to the Time Machine. Of course, being that both halves of the Time Vault combo are artifacts, there's an intense density of tutors in this effect already outside of the black tutors. So cards like Reshape, War of Invention, Tezzeret the Seeker, these create consistency in ways that aren't addressed with the pointing of the black tutors like Demonic and Vampiric, that, curb sort of the A plus B of Flash and Oracle in a way that don't curb Time Vault at this stage. I mean, the fourth best tutor is still measurably stronger in the Time Vault deck than the fourth best way that finds both halves of the Flash or the Oracle's A plus Bs. It's interesting to evaluate cards from the effect density perspective because we do see such a pull. Tutors can see play in every type of deck, but where they're most egregious and most problematic is inside of the effect density problem in Framework 5. Framework 6. The card is too powerful within decks because it creates problems with specific combinations of cards. This is a category that I identified and built out to find a place to talk about cards like Yawgmoth's Will, Gifts Ungiven, Intuition, Spellseeker. These are cards that aren't really that relevant by themselves, and even recognizing here that Gifts and Intuition and Spellseeker are all flexible tutors, what really brings them to strength and what brings them to the forefront and earns them the point is the fact that they are a part of combos with other cards. Like, Gifts can find the full A plus B combo for any of the big three A plus B combos. Both Gifts and Intuition assemble Underworld Breach lines with relative ease. Both cards have these great synergy with graveyard decks. They're played in Reanimator, some Scraps, Brews, things like that. Yawgmoth's Will is a good card to talk about in this framework because it sort of lives on the points list thanks to the exact point spread of Lotus plus Breach plus Will. Those cards together, right? If you had access to 10 points being Lotus, Breach, Will, that's an absolute monster point spread for Storm decks. And the Council, I think, pretty justifiably fears that point spread becoming a very dominant and, reducing the amount of viable point spreads to that specific combo, given how strong that Storm spread would be. Spellseeker is sort of a perfectly reasonable tutor unto itself. I don't think that it's, outside in terms, it's uniquely strong outside of it in comparison to, say, Vampiric Tutor, even within a Thoracle spread or a Flash spread. Like, it's a perfectly reasonable tutor within those outside of the concerns around density. But it earns its points thanks to its specific synergy with Ephemerate and Time Walk. Those of you who are familiar with Canadian Highlander know that Seeker Walk was a top-tier deck for quite some time. While it's fallen somewhat to the wayside in 2024, it's still a potent creature-based combo deck. It's hard for me to imagine that without Ephemerate, Spellseeker is worth more than 1 point, if it's even worth a point at all. But given that it finds both Flash and Summoner's Pact, it might still be a density issue if we were to point it down. But as long as Ephemerate sticks around and it's still a part of the Seeker Walk combo, it's something that we have to sort of point and be conscious of because of its specific relation to those cards. There are, of course, a lot of cards that aren't pointed that create specific problems with other cards, and these range in strength from, it's a good deck that plays this card to it's a stone cold unplayable deck that plays this card. Some popular and strong ones include, Paradox Engine, which combos with a lot of the draw 7s and artifact-based combo decks. Entomb, which combos with all of the Reanimator effects. But we can range this down towards even, Channel, which synergizes with large colorless things, and eventually find our way to the bottom of this sort of category, looking at something like Second Sunrise, which is a problem if Eggs was a really good deck, but it's not. When combo decks like these, Paradox Academy or Reanimator or Exalia's Pile with Channel in it, if they start taking steps towards meta dominance, we often take a look at these types of cards that are causing problems because we want to be able to point those, combo deck pieces so that we can be more surgical than trying to hit sort of a broad swath of cards. Framework 7. The card is too powerful within decks because it's a part of an archetype that is broadly dominant. This is a category that's somewhat nebulous. The best example in my mind of cards that got pointed thanks to macro archetype dominance are all of the blue cards that live on the points list, and they live there thanks to blue-based midrange. There's a 13-point check and balance to deal with blue pile on the points list right now. We have Ancestral Recall at 8, Dig Through Time at 1, Mana Drain at 1, Mystical Tutor at 1, True Name Nemesis at 1, and Treasure Cruise at 1. I think with these 13 points, we force blue decks to sort of pick and choose between their favorite flavor of this blue midrange. But if we weren't so aggressive in pointing down blue midrange, the best deck in Canlander would be blue pile. And even with these cards pointed in this way, there's still, I think, a strong argument to be made that blue pile is the best deck in Canadian Highlander. It's important to me to note that I think blue-based midrange is sort of a constant threat to format balance. Every single competitive Eternal format has had blue-based good cards as a dominant macro strategy for a very, very long time. And Canlander is no exception to that rule. Where Canlander has pointed many of these good blue cards, there is a dearth in generically strong non-blue pointed cards. Things like Fourth Aerlingus is a good example of a non-blue, generically strong pointed card, but it's kind of the only one. I've been speaking for some time in other mediums about the problems I believe are associated with the Jeskai core dominance. It's a deck that plays as many of these generically powerful cards that are free to include as it possibly can. And variations of it, like Jeskai Green or Jeskai Black, simply try to find more of those extremely powerful cards and put them in their deck as well. This sort of creates a deck that is dominant through non-pointed cards rather than pointed ones, which makes it especially hard to regulate via pointing. I think Recall to 8 did push Jeskai down, and it sort of forces it to an even more narrow sort of, pick the best of the pointed blue cards. But I'm not convinced necessarily yet that was enough. And I guess time will tell if that was sufficient to sort of address the Jeskai core's extreme strength. Framework 8. The card is too powerful within decks because it fundamentally warps the game itself around its presence in the game. There are cards that, when they hit the field, become the game unto themselves. Planeswalkers do a good job of fitting this category. They become sort of must answers, otherwise you will be buried by the weight of their value. Cards like Oko, 3-mana Teferi, Minsc, Boo, these cards tend to have this effect in that when they resolve, they are the game until they're addressed. Even the less potent threats like Jace the Mind Sculptor or the 5-mana Teferi, they'll bury you in card advantage if left unchecked. And in terms of pointed cards, I think True Name Nemesis is the most apparent example of this effect. Once it resolves, the game becomes about the True Name Nemesis. For the most part, you can't remove it, you can't easily attack into it, and unless you're already in a somewhat dominant position, you're now facing a clock that, for the most part, you can't really hope to address. You either have to race it or you die to it. I think Umezawa Jite is also a card that fits within this domain. It makes combat more about the Jitty than it does about whatever else is sort of happening within the combat step. But when we're talking about cards that fundamentally warp the game, there's one card that I've got a bit of a bone to pick. Footnote 1, Comet, Stellar Pup. What the fuck were they thinking with this card? Okay, Comet is one of those cards that most of the time is a perfectly reasonable Magic cards. Like, there are other effects in Magic that have randomness, right? Mana Crypt, Gamble, even cards that are pseudo-random like Tainted Pact or Demonic Consultation. Like, they have risk and they have reward, but when you're playing them, you get to leverage the strength of the card and make decisions based on the probability or the ways that you can mitigate the potential downside. Like, randomness is not inherently bad. And I don't want to come across as saying that it is. Like, it's okay to have randomness in our game. We roll a die to determine who goes first at the start of every game. But Comet, oh boy. Sometimes Comet decides that you are going to win the game right now. The downside to playing Comet is that you have to play a card with the other 5 abilities that aren't roll another die. And these abilities are perfectly reasonable, right? There's a small risk that sometimes you just pick up a land, you make a couple blockers, you play a 4-mana lava axe. But, given the fact that you're getting a planeswalker, those things are all somewhat reasonable, albeit, a little bit below the rate you might want for each effect individually. But this is not really a strong enough downside, in my opinion, to mitigate the fact that this card defines games by itself. It doesn't just define games, it determines games by itself. You can crunch the numbers and calculate the strength of Comet on any given board state. But the fact that sometimes games are absolutely and immediately and empirically determined by Comet and by no other measure of skill is something that deeply frustrates my competitively oriented brain. Like, I can make my peace with Mana Crypt, sometimes rolling hot and you take no damage, or the perfect gamble that pitches the Brain Freeze or whatever for your Breach deck, but like, taking all of the Magic that has been played thus far and rendering it null and void because you let a 4-mana Planeswalker resolve and then they just rolled 4 6s, it just doesn't feel right. Comet to 1, if only because he makes decision making irrelevant. Framework 9. A card is too powerful within decks because it's a part of an archetype that invalidates other archetypes. This is a simple point when thinking about the mechanical of these types of cards because it's something that is a relatively high bar to clear in Canlander. Umezawa's Jitte pushes down aggro decks, and so the concern that it invalidates an archetype has kept it locked away for some time, which is, I think, a pretty reasonable perspective to have. I think the most clear example of when archetype invalidation happens is when combo decks are dominant, especially combo decks that are very hard to interact with. Canlander is a format where cards like Lightning Bolt are supposed to be good, and Bolt is not. Bolt is a very sad card in a world of Thassa's Oracles and Underworld Breach Storm decks. And so if your combo decks are invalidating aggro decks, you have an archetypal problem. While this is a video on second tier frameworks, this section sort of directly ties into that first pillar of archetypal viability. You may notice a bit of a trend as I get later on into this video and into this discussion. Blue-based good decks tend to invalidate the more synergistic decks if left unchecked. When you can save your interaction in your blue-based mid-range deck to hit specific keystone deck pieces, then you just beat their, less powerful synergy cards with your more powerful, generic cards. You have you end up with a very good matchup spread. And one of the strengths of the non-blue decks, and especially the fast mana decks, is that they get to play synergistic cards with either the speed from fast mana to get underneath the engines of the blue-based midrange, or they just develop threat after threat, and they don't care if you interact with any individual one of them, because at the end of the day, they only need to stick 1 or 2 of those threats, and they're just going to beat you to death with it, and you don't have to worry as much about losing to the weight of the card efficiency of the blue-based mid-range decks, which is sort of why strong aggro decks play such a crucial role in the Canlander ecosystem. So if you have these combo decks, which are a part of this archetype that invalidate the aggro decks, it results in the surge of blue mid-range to address the combo decks. So and I think this is something the council is very aware of. They're very cognizant of this sort of very careful balance that needs to exist. But mostly this framework applies to the combo decks that do a really good job of invalidating non-interactive aggro decks, because the non-interactive aggro decks have to be strong enough to keep blue mid-range sort of in check in some ways. Framework 10. The cards are too powerful within decks because it fundamentally warps the meta around the card's presence, or the deck's presence within the metagame. This is a sort of a short sub-note to Framework 9. It's very similar, but it's distinct enough that I want to mention it. If a deck is strong enough to cause other decks to shift around its presence, that can be a bad thing as well, and maybe an indicator that that deck needs to be pointed. A good example would be if, say, Reanimator decks are very, very dominant. Now, every other deck needs to play multiple pieces of graveyard interaction in order to address all of these Reanimator decks. I think it's plenty reasonable to have a dominant deck that uses a strategy that other decks will play silver bullets to address. Like, it's okay to have 1 or 2 pieces of graveyard hate so that you have those pieces available to you if you need to address with graveyard decks. But when you're warping deck building to the point where the deck is so dominant that other decks are dedicating 4, 5, 6, 7 pieces of hate just to deal with it, there's probably a problem. Like, it's fine for you to play a Collector Oof or Brotherhood's End to deal with artifact decks, but if you're playing Collector Oof and Stony Silence and Null Rod and 4 other pieces of artifact removal because artifact decks are just too dominant, then the artifact decks are a meta warping effect that sort of needs to be addressed with a pointing effect. Chapter 3. Framework 11. The card is not resonant to Canadian Highlander because it's not aligned with the vision or identity of Canadian Highlander. Chapter 3 is sort of the most subjective and esoteric of the frameworks. I sort of broke these ones down into this sort of resonant to Canadian Highlander because it's something that I think is important to remember and keep in mind when talking about pointing cards. Canadian Highlander is a competitive tournament format, and a good tournament format has a vision, it has an identity, and it has a skill expression. From a vision perspective, I think it's very clear what our format is trying to do, and sort of Framework 11 is trying to put a sub framework on the hierarching sort of pillars. Like, we are aware of what the council knows what their vision is for the format. The community knows what our vision is for the format. The players agree on what the vision is for the format. And while there will always be dissenting opinions and players who like one thing or another, by and large, these are the factors that guide our format. Our identity, what makes us distinct from other Highlander formats, what makes us distinct from other Eternal formats, is also pretty clear. There's exactly one format with 100 card singleton, no sideboards, no command zone, and the points list. We have our own metagame. We have our decks that are unique to the format, that are preserved throughout time. Our community has a good sense of what Canadian Highlander should look like, and more importantly, what it should feel like. A common shorthand I think I've heard to describe our format is constructed cube. And when Canadian Highlander decks stop feeling like a constructed cube deck, I think players feel that. They experience that in their games, and they begin to complain. And it's important, I think, to remember when we're talking about pointing cards is that if a card does not align with the vision or identity of constructed cube or whatever other vision or identity you want to frame Canadian Highlander with, that's a good indicator that we should point that card. For what it's worth, I think our format's in a phenomenal place. I think the stewards of the format are doing an excellent job, and they're keeping us on track with the vision, with the identity, with the idea that all of the players of the format have bought into. And so I think we're doing a good job with this, but I think it's still a framework worth considering. Framework 12. The card is not resonant to Canadian Highlander because it damages skill expression. And from a skill expression perspective, there are sort of 3 things I want to touch on: deck building, piloting, and then a tournament/meta evaluation. When cards reduce the skill expression of any of these 3 factors, they should be considered for uppointing. And a lot of this stems from the previous frameworks. When cards are free to include, they reduce deck building expression. When cards do too much, it reduces the decision tree of piloting your deck. And when cards are a part of dominant archetypes, it reduces the need to think about meta considerations when you're attending tournaments. There's a sort of dueling philosophy here between skill expression within the point selection and sort of minimizing the number of pointed cards. There's a common refrain within Magic that restrictions breed creativity, which I think is generally true. When you have to choose between 60 permutations of points for your deck, there are many more decisions that have to go into what cards you choose to play than when you're choosing between 6. To point the fewest number of cards, however, you do have to make it so your decisions are just fewer. There's do you want to play, Crypt Mox Ring or Crypt Ring Vault or Ring Mox Mox? And at some point, like, you're running out of other rational point spreads to choose between for your deck. The greater the number of pointed cards, the greater the amount of skill expression exists within determining which pointed cards you put in your deck. And vice versa, the fewer number of pointed cards, the fewer decisions you have to make while determining what your point spread is going to look like. I also think that the greater the number of points cards are worth, the fewer deck building expression or skill expression via deck building gets to appear within the format. Ancestral Recall at 6 with 12 1-point blue cards is a much more nuanced and interesting and complex question than Ancestral Recall at 8 with 5 1-point blue cards. There's just not as many choices. I do think that the Council does a solid job of balancing this dichotomy. You can look at, Australian Highlander, 7-point Highlander, and you can see what happens when you swing all the way to this point everything scale. Like, I do think that right now we should point slightly closer to the point everything. I think a few more 1-point cards would add a lot of deck building depth. It reduces the ease of just playing the good stuff pile. And I don't really want good stuff piles to be the best pick into a blind meta. But I do recognize here that this would require a little bit of a philosophy shift, right? We would need to tweak our dial a little bit further away from the let players play with everything and a little bit closer to the, make players make choices, make players have to give up some number of cool, fun cards, which is fine. Like, I think we're in a good place right now, but I think it would be a little bit nicer if we were to tweak that dial a little bit further towards the more aggressive pointing philosophy than the more conservative one. Framework 13. It's not resonant to Canadian Highlander because it's not fun. The last framework is the most subjective of all the frameworks. At some point, regardless of the strength of a deck, some cards need to be pointed because they damage the resonant gameplay of the format. And there's a few cards that used to be pointed that fit this criteria. Mind Twist, Balance, these created very specific types of gameplay and often reduced the gameplay to, well, I got mind twisted. Guess that's it. Since then, of course, these cards have been unpointed, but the fact exists that there are other cards that create this type of problem that are worth talking about. Comet. Everyone has a type of deck that sort of pisses them off, right? But more than any other, people really, really, really hate playing against the A+B combo decks. For many folks, the least satisfying way for a game to end is via an A+B combo. And people tend to remember the ending of a game more than the middle of one. So regardless of whether or not it was sort of this complex, hard-fought battle to get to the A+B, the fact that the game just ended in that moment with no further input tends to leave a sour taste in people's mouths. And moreover, combo decks tend to be the fastest decks in the format. Their goal is to play either the fewest amount of Magic or the greatest amount of Magic by themselves. And in either of those two outcomes, their opponent leaves the game feeling that they didn't really get a chance to do anything. I think this is a really interesting phenomenon, and I think it actually educates far more of the pointing philosophy than it deserves. There was a phenomenal observation made that was brought, at least the first time I saw it. I'm not sure if it was the first time it's ever been brought, but it was first brought to the forefront of my mind by Cyclops in the Canlander Discord, and sort of paraphrasing his point here. The community and council are far more tolerant of dominant archetypes when that archetype is literally anything that isn't combo. There is a huge community response and council response when combo decks start winning too much. There's a fair aspect here that, when combo decks win, they push out the aggro decks, which prey on the dominant blue midrange decks. But more than just that, I think it's that combo-defined formats make people upset. Personally, I'm a tough nut to shake. I'm a tournament grinder. I'm a spike. I got into Canlander via Paradox Academy. And when I found myself losing over and over and over to blue-based midrange decks, I just picked up a deck that beats blue midrange. I don't care. I would rather win than have fun, because winning is fun, at least for me. This is not the way that most people experience Magic, and it's something that we need to be cognizant of when combo decks are dominant, because we will stifle the community through these decks that people find unfun to play against. Footnote 2. Human psychological evaluation. I think there's a gaping hole in card strength assessment and deck strength assessment, which comes from how interactive a game is being as an analog to the competitiveness of the game. So what I mean by this is, I have watched players play a 25-minute game of blue midrange versus anything else, where the game was materially over in the first 4 turns. The difference is it takes another 20 minutes for that blue midrange deck to win. The game is over. There's no question about it. Any competent pilot is going to, even if these players are, exactly equal in skill. The blue mid-range deck has established what they need to have the game end. It just is going to take another 20 minutes for that to happen. The difference here is that versus combo, the game is just actually over. Like, the player is out of time to make a decision that matters. Versus when they're playing through this 20-minute thing, they feel that there's still the ability to win. There's this whole formality of playing it out because they're not technically dead yet. And like, I understand that there's always the ability for the comeback story. Like, it does happen, right? But like, the games that are already over, turns before, like, they're the games that are material over turns before they are actually over, is something I think a lot of people who aren't tournament oriented, they just don't realize. Like, this isn't to disparage that, you're here to play Magic, not to not play Magic, but like, I think people just have a blind spot to this idea that your game can be over, minutes or tens of minutes before the game is actually over. And so it feels better to lose to Jeskai than it feels to lose against an A+B combo deck, because the game was determined on turn 4, but it only ended on turn 12 versus ending on turn 4 itself. Combo is the gatekeeper of fun. And as a combo player, like, I understand why we get scrutinized so aggressively relative to other archetypes. I think what I want here isn't to stop being scrutinized in that way. Like, I get it. Like, let's keep combo decks in check. But like, let's recognize just how egregious the blue-based mid-range decks can be in these subtle ways that are really hard to point or pin down. Like, sometimes we just need to point the generically good cards to put, to downtick the strength of the good stuff piles. I think we're a little too tolerant of the non-combo dominant decks, as opposed to the speed and the efficiency and the aggression that is put when combo decks are dominant. And these non-combo dominant decks lead to subtle deck building changes, and it leads to stifling metagames, because like, there's no obvious or easy solution to beating the generic blue good pile than just playing another generic good blue pile. And with that, we close out Framework 13. So in closing, Comet to 1, down with Jeskai, long live combo, and thanks for listening.